Today, we're diving into something that's shaking up the foundations of businesses and how they get discovered online. SEO, essentially, in the age of AI. So, Sandeep, is someone who has been closely tracking and experimenting with AI driven search specifically. You wrote an interesting article about how AI powered search engines like ChatGPT, Perplexity, and Google's AI overviews are essentially rewriting the rules of SEO. And today I'd like to explore what's changing, what's at risk, and most importantly, what do businesses need to do to stay visible in this new landscape? Before we dive in, tell us what was the moment that made you realize AI was going to fundamentally change SEO?
I think it was not a single point where that realization occurred, but I think I just noticed a change in my own behavior in terms of how I look for information. And I think that's probably what most people are also experiencing right now, which is Google was your default search, and anything you needed to look up, work or otherwise, the first option is open up Google search on the phone or on your desktop and type out the query, and you have a bunch of results to go through and, sift through and find what you're looking for. But I think I've noticed it's not every time. It's maybe 1 in 3, 1 in 4 times that I actually use Google search. And now my searches are spread across ChatGPT, Perplexity, and any other tools that you might be using. And I think this is something that we've also seen at work when we discuss, where we had this sort of information that we processed through one of the AI tools. And I think that occurred to me, and I've sort of began to think more about it. And that was one of the key points that we've addressed in this article about sort of the change in user behavior.
You wrote about essentially how every major shift in technology, whether it was the printing press or smartphones, they changed user behaviors, right? And the way you're essentially seeing it, and I think a lot of us are seeing it, is that AI isn't just another tool, but it is effectively transforming a lot of what we're doing across industry, and in this specific case, search. So whether it's looking up information to just asking questions and getting answers immediately. So you've talked about how you notice the behavioral change on yourself, but how do you sort of see this evolve for users across the spectrum? In fact, Google's trained us to think of keywords and search in a certain way. Is AI essentially untraining us? And how does this then impact businesses that have spent years optimizing search for the old way, essentially?
Yeah. I think this idea of Google training us to search in a certain way came from this book called Who Do You Want Your Customers to Become? The book is referenced in this article, and you'll find a link to it as well. This is an interesting and almost counterintuitive way of looking at how the relationship between innovation and the users of that innovation. And what this book says, and the key point here is that most products and innovative products have an ask, quote unquote. And they ask the user to become another person or evolve into a different person, usually a better version of themselves. And so Google essentially trained us over the years to ask better questions, ask better queries, optimize our keywords and queries as a user, not as a business, but as a user, to try and get the results in as few searches as possible. And so, for example, having a most sort of generic query that says best pizza in town versus best pizza specifically in your area are going to give you very different results. So I think that's something that we learned over the years on what works and what doesn't work with Google. And so that was also a lens through which I looked at how the behaviors have evolved over the years. And like you said, the printing press essentially was a major shift in technology because it allowed the printing of books, which otherwise was all centralized, in large institutions in those days. But publication of books meant the books could be distributed to people and people got access to information. And I think the internet did that in its own way. Social media, again, was another big shift. And I think at each point, if you look back, you'll see how the user behaviors have adapted to that change in technology. And I think with AI now, very soon going to be all around us, I think that will also do the same thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, that goes back to that zero-click environment, right? Where you talked about, how Google changed our behaviors, making it easier to access the information. And now it's taking it up a notch, right? It's moving to that zero-click environment where Google AI's overview are giving us the answers without actually having to send us to a website to get the answers for ourselves. So how real do you see this as how real a threat is this essentially? And what's at stake for businesses today?
Yep. As with everything, technology evolves, and I think the businesses have to evolve. But if you don't, then of course, the change that is inevitable is going to be a threat for the business. So that's how I would look at it. And yes, the change that we're witnessing right now is all of these large tech platforms are essentially building their own walled gardens on the internet. The users of the internet from the 90s and the early 2000s would remember that the internet was a more open place. The birth of Wikipedia and forums and things like that. But now a lot of these big tech platforms, for various reasons, revenue being one of them, would like their users to remain on their platforms for longer. And I think everybody has at some point observed, if they are active on social media, is that if you share a link that takes the user outside of that platform, your content or your post does not automatically reach as wide an audience as it otherwise would have. This happens on LinkedIn, this happens on X and other platforms as well. So, and Google has also started to move in this direction where, because their stated goal is to provide the most accurate, reliable answer to their users' questions as quickly as possible, and without the user having to go through and click a whole bunch of links, which is traditionally how we have looked for information, done our research, compared vendors and made decisions by going to Google, searching, looking through a bunch of websites, comparing, etc. Google ideally wants you to stay on the Google page and get all your answers there. And so the changes that you're noticing on Google, for example, the AI overviews, which shows up at the top, or their own sort of pressures to meet the revenue goals, has meant that more and more space has ceded to ads. And ads are taking up more real estate space than they ever did. And the organic search results are being pushed further down. And I think that is something that most people will notice if they go to Google and search. And I think this has a real impact on businesses that, like you said, that have built a lot of, or has used SEO as a significant channel to drive traffic and bring customers. And this also hits close to home for us, because with our other agency, Pixelmatic, where a lot of the traffic was organic and came via Google, and we are seeing a slowdown there in terms of the organic traffic. So it's just now that any business that has relied on it has to evolve and adapt, and you can't put all your eggs in one basket, for sure.
Yeah, so it seems like Google search is essentially becoming more of an answer engine as opposed to a search engine. And which brings me to the other question about the title of the piece was essentially Google search is dead. It's a fairly bold statement, and AI effectively put the nail in the coffin. But is SEO dead too, or is this just an evolution that you would call it?
Yeah. I mean, just to clarify first, I think Google search technically is, of course, not dead, not even close to being dead, because they still have the largest market share, 90% there and thereabouts. I think 89% last time I checked. But it is on a downward trend, because there are other players that are eating into the market share. And of course, there is also a stat that I read, which is probably mentioned in the article. I think Gartner says by 2028, Google's market share is expected to come down by 50%. But who knows? No one can predict the future. But I suspect that Google will not be as dominant as it is today, and it has been over the last decade. It's essentially been a monopoly. But I think that monopoly will slowly start to fade away. It'll still be a major player. I don't think you can ignore Google Google search, but I don't think it'll be the only player in the search space. And I think coming to how Google search itself might evolve, again, this is something we'll have to see how Google responds to the threats that it faces today, not just from competitors, but also from regulatory authorities in the US and in EU. I think one could potentially see Google search, the interface that we've come to know as having the 10 sort of blue links, the search results. But now more and more seeing ads and AI overviews at the top of the search results page could eventually resemble a chat interface where you're simply having a conversation with Google, and it's crawling, all of the websites on the internet, surfacing the answers and providing that as a response, and then maybe having a link embedded in that response for somebody, if they're really interested, to go through that link and actually read the source of that information.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's obviously a massive pivot for a lot of businesses. And I don't see too many people actually executing on this. What I see is that there's still a lot of heavy investment in old SEO tactics. So from sort of long form articles, keyword stuffed articles, backlink building, what of these strategies is no longer effective essentially in an AI driven search optimization approach?
SEO is, to your previous question, SEO is definitely not dead. Just like everything else that we've been discussing, I think that has changed dramatically given how the landscape has changed. And I think the way you think about SEO, the way you execute SEO has fundamentally changed. What hasn't changed, I think, is the first principles of it, which has always remained the case. But in SEO, a lot of the attention goes towards hyper optimization and hacking your way through ranking at the top, and eventually people end up thinking that is SEO. But keyword optimization, for example, the way it has been done is not working anymore. Even without the AI in picture, the old way of doing SEO is no longer relevant. It doesn't work anymore. In fact, it could do the opposite, where you might end up facing a negative penalty from Google. So I think that approach certainly has to evolve, and I think the thinking behind how SEO now, that includes AI and AI-driven searches from other players in the market and Google themselves, I think we need to update our approach to this.
Yeah. So I just wanted to go back to what you talked about, right? First principles still hold true. And I think we've always talked about, how quality sort of lends to natural SEO, right? You don't have to hack your way through it. You don't have to keyword optimize and all of that. Yes, there are certain pieces that you need to sort of address because they are foundational to great SEO. But what I also noticed is now there's a lot of AI generated content out there, right? And so in the article, you also talk about, how AI generated content essentially has a short shelf life. And I want you to sort of address like why you think that's the case, and should businesses effectively then stop using AI for content creation?
I think this is in fact an interesting topic in itself. I think we have touched on this in our February edition of the newsletter, which talks about how AI is going to go through even a phase of commoditization, because and also sort of the access to AI is going to be democratized. So now everybody has access to AI, and therefore everybody is generating content using AI. And so you're back to a level playing field. You're not doing anything different from anybody else. So then how is your content any different from another person? And so why should any of the search engines, whether it is the traditional search engine or an AI-based search engine, take your answer, which is generated by AI, and give that as the answer to a person who's looking for information versus anything else? I think if you look at it from a first principle standpoint, you're not adding any value with the content that's being generated through AI. That person might as well use ChatGPT to get that answer. Why do they need that answer to come from you? And so if you can't add anything of value that ChatGPT already can provide, then I think there's no point in writing that article. So I think the businesses need to start looking at it from that point of view, not keep a quantity of content goal in mind and then just simply run a ChatGPT or any of the AI tools to produce that amount of content. You might meet your goal of producing X number of posts a week or a day or a month, but you're not going to meet your business goals. You're not going to meet your marketing goals. So I think because everybody is going to be on doing the same thing, there's nothing that is going to differentiate what you do. And I think one of the things, again, this is something that we've linked to and shown an example in our newsletter, where we talk about briefly something called the demo-led SEO approach. Essentially, what now content needs to become is a form of entertainment, if that suits your business and your audience. But in a sense, it needs to be engaging. You can't expect somebody to just come and lots of content. I think the bar for just text-based content is going to be really high. Either you are a well-known author and therefore people will read because of that credibility, or that you've written it so well and people share and say that this is a must-read. Simply writing long-form pieces may not get the attention that you would want.
So what essentially I'm hearing is that, quality definitely trumps quantity. And the way I'm also understanding it is that the focus and commitment to creating original content that does not use AI at all is effectively going to drive your search presence, essentially. While all of that is great in terms of knowing it from a theoretical perspective, let's talk solutions. So in the article, you've sort of highlighted 5 strategies that you think are going to sort of help pivot everyone in the new age of SEO, right? Could you break them down? Why is building a brand authority across platforms like LinkedIn, YouTube, and Reddit far more important than just backlinks? And why should you focus on the quality of your content as opposed to the quantity?
This is another good example of how being so myopic about just wanting to rank on Google and doing whatever it takes has led to this practice of acquiring backlinks through various means and not all of it ethical. And I think that anyway had diminishing returns over the years as Google and Bing to an extent got more intelligent. That approach is definitely not going to work going forward. So why then we come back to this whole point about first principles, and we've, at least in the marketing world and certainly, at Thrive-Matic, we've always believed that brand is one of the core pillars behind, any marketing work that you do. You need to establish that with some amount of clarity and communicate that well. And I think building that brand now and doing that well is going to result in having good search rankings. Why is that? If you look at some of the data that's out there, and we've linked to a couple of articles, one from SparkToro, and then there's a couple of others who have done great research to sort of get insights on how people or what are people using Google for, and what sort of queries are used, and so on. And more than 40% of the queries on Google are branded keywords, are brand related. So these are people who already are aware of the brand and are coming to Google and almost using Google as a yellow book, as a place where they can type the brand name, and then Google will tell you this is where the business is located, this is the website, this is the LinkedIn profile, etc., etc. And then you can go to the right property to get some specific information you're looking for. There is intent there, and they're also aware of the brand. Expecting now a user to discover a brand on Google, I think is no longer going to happen. That's at least what the data seems to be suggesting. The consequence of building a good brand means that you're going to be you're going to rank well on Google, because Google is going to surface those results if you have done, of course, again, going back to the whole idea of first principles, if you've done the SEO, the fundamentals of it, make sure that your website is indexed, make sure that you have good internal links, the website structure is good, and all of those things, then Google recognizes that, yes, this is the brand's website and somebody's searching for this brand. And so I will prioritize the pages and the links from this website over others. And so that is one example of how building a brand could benefit you on Google search. And this applies even to other AI-based search options now, whether it's Perplexity or ChatGPT. They're all training their models to detect entities. And a business is an entity. And if you've done a good job of connecting the various aspects of your entity and the different properties where your entities are present and connected, then they know how to piece that information together and give you a more accurate response. So this building a brand is not just for Google search, but also for ChatGPT and others.
So what I'm essentially hearing is that generic content is not going to fly anymore. And so, for a business or a brand to be recognized by AI and Google, and for it to be rewarded by being recognized by AI and Google, they need to rethink their content strategy around their intent rather than focusing on your keywords and rankings, which is, I think, something that everyone's been doing all this while. I think also what I'm taking away from this is that we need to be looking beyond blogs, and there is a lot of structuring that needs to be done, appropriate structuring that needs to be done. So can you just talk a little bit about, the role of that structured data and the schema markup and how that's going to impact everything around a brand and a business and make it AI friendly, essentially?
Yeah. So think of it this way. If you have unstructured data, you're basically making it harder for these crawlers to crawl through your website and understand what it is. Structured data has a set sort of format, and so it's easier for them to know what this is and then make sense of it. So that's essentially what structured data is. By doing that and implementing that on your website, I think you're going to have all of these benefits that we spoke about. And particularly, again, large language models would want access to that kind of information. That's another thing that, for example, you need to now start paying attention to, which is in your Google Analytics and Google Search Console, you would have seen traffic information about crawlers going through your website. So you would have seen Googlebot that would crawl through your website to index the content on your website. And there is this whole concept of crawl budget and so on, because it is a resource intensive process. So you would want to think about what are the pages that you don't want Google to crawl, for example. That doesn't make sense. You would rather have the bot from Google crawl the more important pages that are more relevant versus other stuff. Similarly, now ChatGPT and Perplexity have their own bots. And you can define these rules in robots.txt. Traditionally, that's where you've done this for Googlebot, but now you can also add specific rules for these LLM-based search engines to say, yes, I will allow them to crawl my website. And you can then further specify what parts of the website you want to be crawled and what would you want them to ignore. There is also talk of an equivalent of a robots.txt, which was made for a traditional search engine. Now, maybe an LLM text file is being discussed as something that can be adopted as an industry standard by these search engines. And if that is the case, then you can create that file and add it on your website. So the crawlers from these AI search engines will look at it and know, yes, these are the guidelines, and I can follow that.
So since we're talking about structuring the website and, crawling websites, how would video, podcasts, interactive content fit into this whole SEO landscape?
I think there are two aspects to it. One, you would need to now start looking at different formats of content and different channels through which you can actually distribute your content. And of course, there are always two parts to the content, which is one is the creation and the production of the content, and the other is the actual distribution of the content, which might be an area for us to deep dive in a future video. But for now, I think videos and other forms of content are important from that perspective. But purely from a website standpoint, from an SEO standpoint, having different ways in which you can present your content with the end goal of making that the entire piece of content more useful, more valuable, and therefore more engaging would mean that they would stay on your page for longer. And so that's also something that the AI-based search engines will look for. And as opposed to seeing a long article with just some bullet points, which they might skip and leave the page quickly, versus seeing different forms of content, interaction on that. For example, this is something that we are doing ourselves, where we are building these AI tools and embedding them in various parts of our website. So you have information that's useful and educational, but there's also live interaction and maybe even a demo of a tool that you can look at. And there's actually a great example of this that someone has done, which we've linked in our newsletter. And I think we'll see more and more of this in 2025 and going.
Great. So yeah, what I want to do also now is I want to take a step back. I want to zoom out a little bit and look at how SEO and AI is evolving essentially. And I want to get your perspective in terms of where do you see search in the next 5 years? Will Google still be the dominant player, or are we seeing a rise of AI native search engines, right? And how much of our decision making do you think AI will effectively take over? Because I see a lot of that already happening, that a lot of people are relying heavily on AI to do not only just the grunt work, but a lot of the thinking, the strategy, the ideation, the building out execution plans. So, while AI is so entrenched in a lot of our daily operations, how does this then affect user behavior when it comes to search and optimize search for businesses, say in the next 5 years?
Firstly, thinking that the way SEO used to work no longer works, and all the data that seems to suggest that Google is sending less and less traffic from search to websites, and similarly other platforms like we talked about earlier with regards to walled gardens, and then arriving at the conclusion that SEO is no longer a good marketing channel, I think is the wrong conclusion to come to. I think that it's still a great marketing channel. It's just that the approach and the way we think about it needs to evolve, because the technology has evolved, and how people search for information is evolving, and I think is going to evolve. How it will actually end up 5 years from now, your guess is as good as mine. I think, predicting the future is not for the faint of heart. But I think instead of looking at what the future is going to be, looking at the sort of current scenario of how search in particular has already evolved and how people are beginning to change their user behaviors with respect to search, I think now is a great time for businesses to start adapting their websites, their content strategy to this changing user behavior. And like we've talked about, I think first principles, when you approach SEO content, I think that makes a huge difference. Second, when it comes to content, if you're going to create content that ChatGPT can produce in a few seconds, then you're not adding any value. So go back and ask that question to yourself and your team. Are we adding any value? One way to do that, for example, is original research. Can you research and create something that cannot be found anywhere else on the internet? And then therefore it will become valuable to people. I think how the search engines work is something that we are all discovering and learning how they work. And therefore we have to respond to that. And it's a dynamic sort of ongoing and evolving process. So I think some of the strategies that we have suggested are places where we start, but that's not the be all and end all of how we would do SEO. I think it needs to constantly change and adapt and evolve every few months based on what we're seeing.
Okay, so if you were to advise a business today, and I know we do a lot of SEO work for clients already, but if you were advising a new business today on SEO, what's the one thing that you would tell them they have to start doing immediately is to sort of future-proof their SEO strategy?
I think the first is make sure that your website's technical SEO is solid. I think that's the foundation. Then when you actually look at SEO, and most people look at keyword optimization and SEO as sort of mean to be the same thing, don't follow any of the approaches that have been followed for the last 10 years. Look at search intent versus just keywords. Look at what is the intent behind that keyword, and then start to optimize for that. And as an offshoot of that, also start tracking how results for that keyword are showing up on Google, for example. Is that showing up as an AI overview? Then your approach might be a little different. If the result for that keyword is not an AI overview, then you would want to look at it slightly differently, because the click-through rates are, from a recent study, very different for different kinds of search results. So how are you showing up in the search results, I think also matters. And I think then you are also looking at content. We've discussed how content also has to evolve and adapt. And I think that's, as we've always known, content and SEO go hand in hand. So I think the approach to that also needs to change. And I think with how ChatGPT and Perplexity start to surface content, the best way to do this is to keep running experiments, to keep looking at how your brand shows up in a ChatGPT response, or is it even showing up? So, for example, I came across somebody who did this little experiment of how you can give feedback to a search-based or AI-based search engine, which gives you a response, and you don't think it is accurate. They have an option for you to give feedback. And if you give feedback and go back and look at it again after a while, the chances are, at least in this case, the person saw the feedback being incorporated into the response the next time. So I think there are lots of new tactics and strategies that will come up to adapt to the way AI search engine works. And so this is a space that we are definitely going to track very closely and keep sharing these insights with our audience.
Okay, that's very helpful. And I know we've talked about first principles, and I know we've talked about that being the core of everything you do when it comes to SEO. If we had to revisit this conversation a year from now, what's beyond the first principles, what's the biggest change in search that you'd sort of bet on in terms of being something that would sustain over the next year?
Yeah, I think, again, because content and SEO are sort of so tied together, I'm starting to look at content and the ability now, and we discussed this, of how everybody can create content. I think code is going to be as good as content now. You can generate code now with AI, and this is what we've already started doing. This has been our experiment for the last 3-4 months, to build tools that are going to be useful for our audience and our clients, and make that available to the audience on our website. So it is a form of content, but we're making content interactive. And I think there's a lot more that we can do. And I think that is something that I feel is going to be actually useful. Somebody getting value, not just by reading, but by interacting with it and being able to customize it to their needs and their queries. I think that could be an area that might start to do very well. And that's certainly an area that we are betting on at Thrivematic to build our own website around that idea.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. And from what I'm taking away from this is that AI isn't just changing SEO, it's redefining how people find and trust information. Thanks for breaking it down for us. And for anyone who's listening, if you found this conversation valuable, don't forget to subscribe to the Thrivematic newsletter for insights on marketing technology, AI tools, and innovation.